In the name of God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. As we work our way through Jesus' teaching on the bread of life, I think it's helpful for us to keep in mind how we got here. Just the day before, Jesus fed the 5,000 with 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. He then escaped up into the hills to avoid being made king by force. When he avoided that, he walked across the sea to Capernaum. And while he was walking, he was spotted by his disciples in the midst of rough and challenging seas. By the next day, the crowds had followed him across the sea and demanded once again more signs and wonders from Jesus as proofs that he was who he said he was. But instead of signs, he began to teach. And what we heard this morning is some of that. And it isn't, as it might seem in isolation, a lesson that Jesus is giving on Eucharistic theology. Instead, it's an exposition on those 2 signs that he'd performed, feeding the 5,000 and walking on water. And it's an exposition on his identity. Now, while it's hard to hear this gospel without thinking immediately of the bread that we receive in Holy Communion, what's really at stake here is the crowd's understanding, our understanding, of who Jesus is, what Jesus' nature is, and by extension, who God is. It's yet another exposition of the truth expressed in the prologue to John's Gospel. In the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And the Word became flesh and lived among us, and we have seen his glory, the glory as of a Father's only Son, full of grace and truth. I am the living bread that came down from heaven. Through its rich imagery and metaphor, John's Gospel provides to us a constant check and a challenge to the images of God that we paint in our own heads. It's a reminder of our inability to comprehend the incomprehensible. It has provided this service to generation after generation of Christians, and at times it has scandalized those same people. And it scandalized them because so often we want the God who appears transfigured on the mountaintop. We want Jesus robed in white, standing in his incomprehensible glory. Those who followed Jesus across the sea that day wanted more signs. They wanted him to be a king, but a king of the style that they had in mind. They wanted him to be exactly what they had hoped for, exactly what they had imagined, and nothing more. The challenge and gift of Jesus' teaching on the bread of life is the reminder that we will often meet God in just the opposite sort of ways. Over the years, I've dabbled on and off with baking bread. I've read books, I've learned as much as I could about the craft, and I have baked many, many, many horrible loaves of bread. And a few that I'm a little proud of. In doing all of this, I've come to appreciate the skill, technique, and artistry that goes into transforming simple elements, flour, water, salt, and yeast, into beautiful loaves of bread in all their complex varieties, making use of only time and heat. But even with that added appreciation, bread is still rarely, for me, the main event at any meal. It's still bread. As extraordinary as any loaf might be, it's a common element on the table. Oftentimes it's given little, if any, thought, pushed off to the side. And so it's that, the ordinary, common, simple loaf of bread with which Jesus identifies himself. I really wish that we had the whole of the Old Testament narrative that we heard this morning. We get the bit of it that has to do with bread, and not any of the rest. But Elijah, to give you the context, has just triumphed mightily in a contest with the priests of Baal. But it's not enough for him. He goes off into the wilderness, and we see the bit that we get today. And we end our lesson with his arrival at Mount Horeb. And it was there that Elijah didn't find God in the great wind, didn't find God in the earthquake or in the fire, but, depending on your translation, in deafening silence or a still small voice. God was present and acting in all that Elijah had done, but it wasn't what he needed to see. It wasn't the way that he needed God to be interacting with him. And God found him and spoke to him in the most unexpected of ways, and in the way that he needed at that moment. My friends, the scandal, the challenge, and the hope of the incarnation is that God has entered the world through the humblest and most ordinary of ways, in ways that would never have been thought of or expected. God has entered the world by becoming exactly like us, frail, fragile, common, and ordinary. To adapt a phrase from one of the early doctors of the church, in taking on this common, simple, humble role, God has made the extraordinary into the ordinary, so that the ordinary might at the last become extraordinary.